Students with disabilities in our nation have had a long fight and struggle towards acceptance, education, and inclusion in the classroom. Starting during the Enlightenment period, disabled students have now worked their way to receive proper facilities and treatment beyond even public high school. The 19th century looked towards the education of disabled citizens as a way to protect children and protect society from those with disabilities. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet founded the first American institution for individuals with disabilities in 1817. Gallaudet believed it was his moral and spiritual responsibility to educate the disabled. He created the Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons under the notion that it is of strong importance to awaken the consciousness of God. After the founding of this institution, by 1860, 28 out of 33 states had created an asylum. The average age of the students in these institutions was 22 years old. Thus, children with disabilities were not receiving any support.
In 1846, Samuel Gridley Howe began a fight to the state legislature of Massachusetts to ask to fund the creation of a school for the disabled. By 1848, Howe received state funding to create the experimental school for the teaching and training of idiotic children in Boston. Edward Seguin of France influenced pedagogical methods for the disabled in 1866. He recommended that schools should teach no more than 150 to 200 students so educators can know, care, and plan for their students appropriately. In addition, Seguin asked the facilities to be located in rural areas and that the schools focused on the education of motor, sensory, physical training, intellectual training, and socialization. In the late 19th century, people at this time went backwards in their views of mental handicaps and began to fear these citizens because they believed that Seguin was not able to teach these children how to function independently in society. Americans created two solutions to mental disabilities: sterilization and segregation, resulting in institutionalization. And unfortunately, through institutionalization, students with disabilities received horrendous living conditions, abuse, and inappropriate treatment and inappropriate education towards their disability.
The 20th century saw the rise in increased awareness, treatment, and most importantly, legislations to support students with disabilities. Beginning with the compulsory education laws of 1917, special education classes were enacted into the school systems. Because of these laws, schools were no longer allowed to ignore intellectually disabled students. However, integrated classes with intellectually disabled were poorly run by teachers who were unenthusiastic towards running these inclusive classrooms. Thus, classes became segregated to attain to the laws and the wishes of the teachers rather than attaining to the needs of the students.
It was not until the Russian launch of Sputnik, which provoked a positive emphasis on American education and positively affected special education. With this movement, John F. Kennedy introduced the National Action to Combat Mental Retardation. In January 1971, the Pennsylvania Association for the Retarded Children, PARC, brought a class action lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in federal district court. PARC was resolved by an agreement that all children with mental disabilities between ages 6 and 21 must be provided with free public education. Cases similar to PARC were filed across the country. However, many students with disabilities continued to be denied adequate public education.
The first federal legislation to advance the opportunities for students with disabilities was the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which called for equality in activities and to ensure proper facilities were constructed. In 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which was later named Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act in 1990, mandated free and appropriate education for students with disabilities. The legislation is a combination of the Civil Rights Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In 1997, Clinton signed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act amendments, which amended and reauthorized the IDEA. This act was to improve the performance and achievement of students with disabilities in the special as well as the general education curriculum.
Based off of the various reformers in legislation, today special education implements early intervention courses, highly trained educators, and appropriate facilities, characteristics of schools which were clearly invisible during the earlier centuries.
With No Child Left Behind, passed in 2001, students with disabilities are not excluded from schools' accountability systems because of the fear that if they were excluded, then these students would be ignored. During the required assessments, these children are allowed accommodations, modifications, or alternate assessments under IDEA. The special education teachers are forced to conduct meaningful assessments, interpret the results of their students' assessments, and utilize programs and strategies that will enhance the students' learning.
Today, Americans with disabilities are given more opportunities than ever before. With the passage of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, a broader definition of what constitutes a disability has been established, and in turn, students with less recognized mental disabilities, such as autism spectrum disorders, are allocated the same amount of resources as those with obvious physical impairments. For much of the 20th century, students with mental disabilities were often characterized as either eccentric or mentally retarded, but a deeper understanding of diversity combined with recent awareness of autism spectrum disorders has led to new innovations in special education.
Nationally, 61% of students across all disability categories are placed in general education classes 80% of the time or more. In contrast to this, the introduction of inclusive education for students with disabilities is starting to gain widespread popularity. The College of New Jersey's Career and Community Studies program helps acclimate students with severe mental disabilities to adult life by providing them equal access to collegiate services through integrated classes, vocational opportunities, and student mentors. Through education reform, it is clear that students with disabilities are now given opportunities beyond the public sector of the classroom.
Through this process, the integration, acceptance, and education of students with disabilities will allow students of all backgrounds and learning capability a chance to progress beyond today's classroom.